They say Mother's Day is a time to honor the women who gave us life, who carried us, fed us, fought for us when we couldn't fight for ourselves. A time for flowers, for kind words, for warm embraces. But that year, my gift wasn't a bouquet or a handwritten card. It was a stack of real estate documents and a pen. I was seated at the head of the dining table, just as I had been for decades. There was a roast in the oven, soft jazz playing from the speaker, and the faint scent of lavender drifting through the open windows. My son, Ethan, stood beside me with a nervous smile. His wife, Danielle, hovered close behind, one hand on his shoulder, the other clutching a manila folder. They had invited me to a small Mother's Day lunch. Just for us, they said. Just family. Just love. Instead, as I lifted my glass of iced tea, Danielle slipped the folder onto my placemat. Ethan said something about legal clarity, about avoiding future complications. He called it a simple formality. Danielle called it a loving gesture of trust. I called it what it was, a transaction, one they had wrapped in lace and lies. I looked down at the documents. A deed transfer. They wanted me to sign away the house, my house, to them, right then and there, between bites of chicken salad and strained pleasantries. What they didn't know, what they never thought to imagine, was that I had met with an attorney 2 weeks earlier, and I wasn't nearly as fragile as they believed. My name is Margaret Caldwell, and I'm 72 years old. For most of my life, people knew me as the woman behind Maggie's Deli, the tiny sandwich shop on Main Street that smelled of fresh rye bread and dill pickles, where every sandwich came with a story. I opened that place when Ethan was 4 years old and still refused to eat anything that wasn't cut into triangles. My husband Robert had passed away the year before in an accident so sudden it shattered the quiet rhythm of our little home like a dropped teacup. One moment he was fixing the gutters, cursing the spring wind, and the next he was gone. A ladder slipped, a blow to the head. He died before the ambulance even arrived. I didn't cry that night, not out loud. I held Ethan close, his tiny fingers clenched in my shirt as I sat on our bed and whispered, "It's just us now, baby, just you and me. But we're going to be all right." And we were. Eventually. I worked 18-hour days at the deli, taking the morning shifts myself and baking at night. I made deals with local farmers for cheap produce and traded homemade pies for janitorial help. I didn't buy new shoes for 7 years, so Ethan could have decent winter coats and violin lessons. Every birthday party I threw him had hand-drawn signs, sandwiches cut like stars, and a cake that I made from scratch, even if it meant staying up till 3 in the morning. When I was 48, a good man named Henry offered to marry me. He was kind, patient, and owned a hardware store down the road. But Ethan was 12, still waking up from nightmares, and I was afraid that bringing a new man into the house would complicate the only thing I had left, our bond. I told Henry no, and I told myself it was the right thing to do. I watched Ethan grow into a strong, smart young man. He got into a state university, graduated with a business degree, and found work at a finance firm 2 towns over. I was proud. I still am. Every cent I had saved, every meal I had skipped to make the mortgage, every cramp in my back from years behind a counter, it had all led to that moment, seeing him in his cap and gown. When he met Danielle, I welcomed her with open arms. She was pretty, confident, and carried herself like someone used to being the smartest person in the room. At first, she was warm toward me. She would compliment my cooking, help clear the table, and say things like, "I always wanted a mother-in-law I could learn from." But something changed after they got married. It was subtle at first. She started reorganizing the kitchen, moving things without asking. She said it was to help me find things more easily. Then she began correcting the way I folded towels, the way I stored groceries, even the way I talked to the dog. She means well, Ethan said once when I mentioned it. She just wants everything to be perfect. Then, 2 years ago, they asked to move in. Their apartment lease was ending, and Ethan had been laid off temporarily. They needed time to get back on their feet, just for a few months, they said. And of course, I agreed. The house was too quiet anyway, and I thought it might be nice to have voices in the halls again. They moved into the upstairs guest room. At first, it was lively. Family dinners, Netflix nights, even Danielle asking for my old recipes. But slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Danielle started managing the household like it was hers. She created chore charts, meal plans, rules about guests. She began referring to the house as our home when speaking to friends. She told me I needed stability and structure, that routines would help with mental clarity at my age. At my age. Ethan, for his part, began to pull away. He was quiet during meals, often gone on weekends. When I asked if something was wrong, he would just smile and say, "It's just stress, Mom. Danielle's been a little on edge lately." I began to feel like a guest in my own home. She moved my knitting supplies into the garage, saying it made the living room look cluttered. She replaced my curtains. She donated my recliner to a modernization charity, as she put it. And one afternoon, I found that the locks on my bedroom door had been changed. When I asked why, she said, "For your safety. Sometimes you forget to lock it at night." That was the first time I realized I was being slowly erased, but I said nothing. I tried to be accommodating, to not make things harder. I reminded myself that I had always been the peacekeeper, the one who didn't escalate. I baked cookies. I cleaned up after their dog. I said thank you when Danielle installed a pill organizer on my kitchen counter. Then came Mother's Day. They planned a lunch, just for us, a small celebration. "No reservations at a restaurant this time," Danielle said. "We want to keep it intimate." They set the table beautifully. Linen napkins, fresh hydrangeas, even my favorite cranberry juice in a crystal pitcher I hadn't seen in years. Ethan carved the roast chicken. Danielle passed the sweet potatoes. It felt almost like old times. Then, just as I reached for my glass, Danielle placed a folder beside my plate. Ethan cleared his throat and said, "Mom, we've been thinking about the future, about your security, your peace of mind." I looked at the folder. "It's just paperwork," Danielle added. "A simple transfer. The house would be under our name, so we can manage things more effectively." "Legally," Ethan said. "It helps avoid confusion down the line." "Of course, nothing changes," Danielle smiled. "You still live here. It's just cleaner on paper." I didn't say a word. I opened the folder. My hands were steady. Inside were documents I had seen before, because 2 weeks earlier I had consulted a lawyer. I had suspected something like this was coming. There were too many comments, too many little slips. So I pulled out my phone, smiled sweetly, and took a photo of every page. Danielle blinked. "What are you doing?" "Just documenting," I said, "for clarity." Ethan looked confused. "You don't need to—" "Oh, it's all right," I said. "I just like to understand things fully before I make decisions." I closed the folder, gently pushed it aside, and took a sip of cranberry juice. The rest of lunch passed in awkward silence. They didn't bring it up again, but I saw it in their eyes, frustration, maybe even fear. They thought I was naive. That age had softened my judgment, that all those years of sacrifice had also stripped me of my voice. They were wrong, and they were about to find out just how wrong they were. After the Mother's Day lunch, Something in the air changed, subtle at first, like the way spring shifts to summer. Danielle became less cordial, more direct. Ethan, once my confidant, now seemed preoccupied, distant. The warmth in their eyes had cooled into something calculating. Within a week, they began mentioning estate planning. Danielle brought it up one morning over oatmeal, saying, "It's important to have a solid plan in place. These days, with property taxes and end-of-life decisions, it's just smart to get ahead of it." Ethan chimed in later that day gently, "Mom, you've worked so hard all your life. Maybe it's time to let others help carry the load." Then came the conversation about wills. "We just want to make sure things are in place," Danielle said, placing a notepad on the table. "Not just for us, but for you too. Peace of mind, right?" The words were wrapped in silk, but their intentions were sharp. There was an urgency now, one they tried to mask with concerned smiles and soft tones. But the undertone was clear. They wanted control, and they wanted it soon. Danielle began referring to the house not as your home, but our property. She said it casually while discussing insurance coverage. I didn't correct her. I just made a note of it. Then came the restrictions. She asked me to let her handle the groceries, so the pantry stays organized. She locked the spice cabinet. One day, she removed all my baking tools and placed them in a bin marked "Donate." "I thought you'd retired from baking," she said lightly. "We have simpler needs now." She installed a baby monitor in the hallway, saying it was for emergencies, in case I fell. But it was always on, always pointed toward my door. Then she changed the locks on the kitchen door. "I'm just worried about stove safety," she said. "Remember that time you left the kettle on?" I hadn't. I never did, but I didn't argue. I just noted the date, the time, and her exact words. When my friend Miriam came to visit, a woman I'd known since childhood, Danielle pulled me aside afterward and said, "In the future, it would be helpful if you could let us know when you plan to have visitors. It disrupts the household rhythm." Disrupts the household rhythm. My own presence, it seemed, was becoming the disruption. I began to document everything, quietly. I recorded conversations on a small device I kept in my pocket. I forwarded emails to a secure account I'd set up with the help of my lawyer, Helen Tran, a brilliant, sharp woman recommended by a friend from church. I kept a journal, listing dates, changes, comments, violations. And one afternoon, while walking past the half-closed door to the upstairs office, I heard Danielle on the phone. "No, we're waiting for the signature," she said. Her voice was low, clipped. "Once it's transferred, we'll have full authority. Yes, I'm aware of the waiting period, but our attorney says that as long as her mental capacity is documented beforehand, it will hold." She paused, then laughed. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing. She's still in that sweet old lady fog." I stood there, frozen. I wasn't in a fog. I saw everything. After that, I met with Helen twice a week. We updated my will. We documented my mental and legal competency through a notary and 2 separate doctors. We issued a formal declaration of retained ownership on the property and submitted it to the county recorder's office. We prepared a full affidavit outlining Danielle's manipulative behavior in case legal recourse became necessary. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. Then one Thursday afternoon, Ethan and Danielle asked me to join them in the living room. There was no coffee, no snacks, no soft music. Just the 2 of them seated on the couch, papers spread across the coffee table. Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Mom, we need to talk. This isn't easy, but it's time." Danielle took over. "We've spoken to a senior care facility, an excellent one, clean, safe, reputable. You'd have your own room, full activities, on-site medical staff. I blinked. I beg your pardon? Ethan looked away. Danielle leaned forward. It's not about punishment. It's about quality of life for all of us. We've signed the agreement. Move-in can happen next month. We'll handle everything. Silence. I let it sit between us like a storm cloud. Then I stood, slowly, walked to the side table and picked up a thin leather folder. I laid it gently beside their papers. What's this? Ethan asked, wary. Documentation, I said, voice calm. From my attorney, medical assessments, notarized affirmations of capacity, a legal record of retained sole ownership of this house, and a formal injunction preventing the sale, transfer, or modification of any property asset without my consent. Danielle's face drained of color. Ethan opened the folder and flipped through the papers with shaking hands. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I met his eyes. No, I don't. But I will, Danielle snapped. This is insane. You're making this harder than it has to be. I looked at her, long and level. You assumed I was too old to understand, too tired to fight, that all those years of raising Ethan alone left me weak. But you forgot one thing. I stepped closer, my voice low. This house, this life, still belongs to me, and I forget nothing. For a long moment, no one spoke. The quiet in the room was heavier than any shouting could have been. Ethan closed the folder with trembling fingers and ran a hand through his hair. His eyes searched mine, not with love, but confusion, as if he truly couldn't understand how things had come to this. Mom, he said softly, you're overreacting. We were only trying to make things easier. For whom? I asked, my voice still calm. Easier for me, or easier for you? Danielle stepped forward, trying to reclaim the conversation. You've misunderstood everything. We were thinking of your health, your safety. You're letting paranoia cloud your judgment. I didn't answer right away. I just reached into the folder and slid out one more document, a transfer of temporary joint custodianship of the property. I had placed my home under co-ownership with a trusted friend, a retired judge named Evelyn Morse, someone immune to pressure and manipulation. She's not just a name on paper, I said. She's my safeguard. No sale, no transfer, no manipulation will happen unless she signs off. And Evelyn? She doesn't sign anything she doesn't believe in. Danielle's mouth dropped open. Ethan looked stunned. You don't trust your own son? I looked at him, my expression softening, just slightly. I trusted you with my life, I said. From the day you were born, I gave everything for you, my youth, my sleep, my dreams. I trusted you when I skipped meals to pay your school fees, when I said no to happiness, because I thought you needed me more than I needed companionship. I paused. But trust isn't unconditional, Ethan, not when it turns into a weapon. Danielle scoffed, a harsh sound in her throat. This is madness. We should have acted sooner. That was all I needed to hear. They packed within a week. Danielle couldn't stand the silence that followed, the loss of power. Ethan avoided me the entire time. On their last day, he offered a brief, stiff hug and whispered, I hope you'll see things differently one day. I already do, I said, and with that they left. The house felt cavernous at first. The absence of their footsteps, their voices, their rules. It was like air returning to a suffocated room. I spent the first evening cleaning, not because it needed it, but because I did. I scrubbed the stove that had been locked away from me. I unlocked the spice cabinet. I opened every window and let the breeze sweep through the rooms like a baptism. I took my time rediscovering things, the floral teacups Robert and I received as wedding gifts, the faded recipe cards written in my mother's curling script, a tin box of photos, Ethan's second-grade art project, Robert with sawdust in his hair, my younger self in a blue gingham dress, holding a baby with sleepy eyes. For the first time in years, I sat in the recliner that hadn't been donated after all. I'd hidden it in the garage, waiting. I brewed myself a cup of chamomile tea. I turned on the radio to an old jazz station and let the notes fill the corners of the house. The following weekend, I called my old church group. Miriam, Lois, Bernadette, women with strong backs and stronger hearts. We planned a weekend trip to the lake. Just us. No rules, no condescension, no clipped smiles hiding sharp intentions. We laughed like girls. We drank wine from paper cups and talked about old loves, lost husbands, and what it means to choose yourself again after a lifetime of choosing everyone else first. As I walked along the edge of the lake at dusk, cool water lapping at my ankles, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Weightless, free, not young, but whole. And now, as I sit by the window in the early morning light, the house warm and quiet around me, I think back to that Mother's Day. People often assume that gifts must come in wrapping paper, with bows and sweet notes. But some gifts come quietly. They come in the form of awareness, boundaries, strength, the rediscovery of one's own worth. That year, my Mother's Day gift wasn't a spa voucher or a handwritten card. It was a lesson, a line in the sand, a home reclaimed, and above all, a reminder that some of the most precious gifts aren't given. They're kept, because sometimes the most powerful act of love is finally loving yourself. It's been 6 months now. The seasons have changed. The hydrangeas in the front yard have bloomed again, this time without being trimmed into neat little shapes by Danielle's sharp pruning shears. The windows stay open more often. The silence in the house no longer feels like an absence, but a choice. Ethan hasn't called, not once. I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting. A mother's love doesn't disappear overnight, even when trust does. But time has taught me that grief doesn't always come from death. It sometimes comes from disappointment, from realizing someone you raised turned into a stranger. And yet, I'm not bitter. There's a peace that comes from standing your ground, especially when no one expects you to. A dignity that returns the moment you stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. I've started journaling again. Evelyn and I meet every Thursday morning for tea and crossword puzzles. I volunteer twice a week at the local library, reading aloud to children whose eyes light up when I do the voices just right. Some afternoons, I sit at the back porch with a cup of Earl Grey, watching the sun tuck itself behind the horizon like a child into bed, and I think about all the women like me, women who gave and gave and gave until someone told them they had nothing left to keep, women who were told that aging meant fading and that kindness meant surrender. But we are not empty. We are not frail. We are a quiet force. This house no longer feels like a battlefield. It feels like home again. A home earned, protected, and finally honored. As for Mother's Day, well, I still get cards. From the children at the library, from Miriam's grandchildren who call me Grandma Mags, from Lois, who bakes me cherry scones every May. And I've come to realize something simple, yet profound. The best Mother's Day gifts don't come in ribbons or gold foil. They come in moments of clarity, in choices reclaimed, in dignity restored. They come in the form of a front door you no longer feel afraid to close, because some gifts are not handed to you. They are taken back and kept.